welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really digging into something that's capturing a lot of attention nationally. It's this escalating confrontation, this standoff between the president threatening federal forces in Chicago and, well, the city itself.
Yeah, it's federal authority versus local governance, playing out in a very intense way.
Absolutely. And it has massive implications, for cities, for states, even for how American federalism works.
Yeah.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to unpack all of that. We're going straight to the sources you've provided.
Right. We want to understand the roots of it all.
Yeah. Where did this start? What are the specific federal actions being talked about? How is Chicago responding? And crucially, what are the bigger legal and political questions here?
And, we're going to explore all the different perspectives laid out in the sources, keeping it impartial, just laying out what the material tells us.
Exactly.
And I think it's worth saying up front, this feels really urgent, maybe even unprecedented in some ways right now.
It does.
But it's also a real intensification of a debate that's been simmering for a long time. This isn't totally new ground.
That's a great point.
It's more like a major escalation, especially in these tensions between the federal government and, well, big Democrat-led cities. It's bringing some deep constitutional questions right to the forefront.
Definitely. Yeah, this didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So to get a handle on it, we need to look back a bit.
Yeah.
What's really behind President Trump's ongoing criticism of Chicago's leaders?
Well, the sources show his focus has really been on city policies.
Like what specifically?
Primarily, it's refusal to cooperate fully with federal immigration agencies. The whole sanctuary city issue.
Right, the sanctuary city label. Maybe we should quickly define that for anyone maybe not totally familiar.
Sure. So basically, a sanctuary city is a local area, could be a city, could be a county that has policies limiting how much its officials, especially police, cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. The idea from the city's side usually is to build trust. They want immigrants, documented or not, to feel safe reporting crimes, talking to the police without fearing deportation.
So they can focus local police on local crime?
Exactly. Keep the focus local. But from the federal perspective, well, they often see these policies as getting in the way of enforcing national immigration law, maybe even obstructing justice.
So it's a fundamental clash of priorities right there. And this isn't the first time the administration has pushed back on this, is it? They've tried before.
Oh, definitely not the first time. There were earlier legal efforts trying to force cities like Chicago to cooperate.
Usually by threatening funding, right?
Precisely. Threatening to pull federal grants and things like that. But here's the kicker, and this is really insightful from the sources.
What happened?
Those earlier attempts, they mostly got blocked in court. Federal judges stepped in.
On what grounds?
They basically said the administration didn't have the federal authority to force cities to act like federal immigration agents or to just withhold money like that. It's a pretty strong legal precedent.
Okay, so the court said no to forcing cooperation through funding threats.
Right. The federal government couldn't just use money to dictate local enforcement priorities. So the fact that the administration is now looking at, more direct action, sending in personnel.
It suggests they're trying a different angle.
Exactly. Testing new legal waters, pushing up against those established ideas of federalism in a way those earlier court fights didn't.
That context is really crucial. And you mentioned Chicago being a focal point. Our sources also link this to the increase in migrant populations arriving in cities across the U.S.
Absolutely. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. The rise in migrant arrivals, which, started building under previous administrations too, it's put enormous pressure on resources in many big cities.
And Chicago's been particularly affected.
It really has. It's seen a significant influx. And that's been, frankly, amplified by Texas officials busing migrants to places like Chicago, these self-declared sanctuary cities.
Right. We've seen those headlines.
So it makes Chicago not just this symbolic battleground over policy, but a very real on-the-ground challenge. Logistically, humanitarily, it ramps up the pressure locally and definitely draws more federal attention.
Okay, so that sets the stage.
Yeah.
Now let's get into the current situation, because this is where things seem to be moving really fast.
Yeah, the escalation phase.
Our sources are detailing preparations by the Trump administration for a, quote, major immigration enforcement operation right in Chicago, possibly kicking off very soon, like early September.
September 5th was mentioned as a potential date.
And it's not just talk, right? There are specifics. Discussions about using the National Guard as backup.
Yes, which immediately brings to mind what we saw in places like D.C. or Los Angeles after some of the protest unrest. That parallel is definitely being drawn.
And reports, too, of armored vehicles, extra federal agents being sent in.
That's what's really fascinating, or maybe alarming, depending on your view. The directness of it all.
How so?
Well, we're moving beyond policy debates or, legal threats about funding. The sources suggest actual physical preparations, armored vehicles, more agents. That signals a very visible projection of federal power.
A significant step up.
A really significant step in the escalation, yeah. From arguments about policy to potentially boots on the ground with specialized gear, it immediately raises questions about, appropriate force, federal overreach.
And how are state officials reacting, particularly Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker?
He's not holding back. Our sources say he strongly criticized the administration for what he calls a total lack of coordination, zero transparency in this planning.
That sounds like more than just a procedural complaint.
Oh, absolutely. It goes right to the heart of state sovereignty. I mean, think about it. Federal forces operating inside a state, maybe without even telling the governor.
Yeah, that feels like a major breach.
It can easily be seen as infringing on states' rights, on local control. It's not just rude, it messes up operations, blurs who's in charge, and can really damage public trust in both state and federal law enforcement. It kind of suggests they're deliberately sidestepping the usual ways of doing things.
And then there's the president's own messaging, using social media to warn the governor directly. Something like, straighten out fast or we're coming.
Yeah, those direct warnings are pretty unusual, president to governor like that.
What's the impact of that kind of public statement?
Well, it certainly turns up the heat, makes it very confrontational. It also serves to publicly pressure, maybe even intimidate local leaders. Doing it this way, outside the normal diplomatic or legal channels, it raises questions about, how government levels are supposed to interact. And it definitely fuels public anxiety about what the feds actually intend to do. It's a very public display of federal will over state autonomy.
So you've got these federal threats, these direct warnings. How is Chicago's leadership, Mayor Brandon Johnson, responding on the ground? What's their move?
They are definitely not backing down. Chicago is doubling down. The sources point to a very firm response from the mayor's office.
In what form?
An executive order. A direct countermeasure to what they anticipate from the federal government.
Okay, an executive order. What does it actually do? What does it say?
It has a few really key parts. First, it flat out bars City Police Chicago PD from cooperating with federal authorities on immigration enforcement.
So no helping with traffic stops for immigration checks, no checkpoints.
Exactly. It reinforces that sanctuary policy.
Yeah.
Local resources won't be used for federal immigration tasks. But then there's a second part, which is maybe even more pointed.
What's that?
It puts restrictions on federal officers operating undercover or masked within the city.
Why is that significant?
Because that's been a huge issue elsewhere, right? When you have federal agents in unmarked gear, no clear identification, it led to widespread complaints about rights abuses, lack of accountability, people couldn't even tell who was arresting them. This order seems aimed squarely at preventing that scenario in Chicago.
And the official arguments from city and state leaders, they're calling the potential federal presence uncoordinated, unwarranted, and unsound. That's strong language.
Very strong. And they're not just saying it's bad policy or unhelpful. They're raising fundamental legal objections.
This is where it gets really interesting, you said.
Yeah, this is where the constitutional arguments really come into play. Officials are arguing these federal actions may violate constitutional limits on presidential powers and states' rights.
Which parts of the Constitution?
They're specifically bringing up the 10th Amendment, the one that says powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people.
Right. States' rights. How does that apply here, specifically?
Well, often when officials cite the 10th Amendment in this kind of fight, they're leaning on something called the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Anti-commandeering.
Yeah, it's a legal principle basically saying the federal government can't just force state or local officials to carry out federal laws for them, which is pretty much exactly what Chicago's executive order is pushing back against. It's a core challenge. You can't make our cops do your immigration work.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about using military assets like the National Guard? Does that bring up different legal issues?
It absolutely does. Deploying military forces, especially the Guard, if it's been federalized, meaning taken out of the governor's control for domestic law enforcement, bumps right up against the Posse Comitatus Act.
Posse Comitatus, what does that restrict?
It's a specific law designed to prevent the U.S. military from being used as a domestic police force. There are exceptions, but they're very narrow, like an act of Congress or a situation of actual insurrection. So the administration isn't just facing the 10th Amendment challenge, they're also running into posse comitatus if they federalize guard units or use other military personnel this way.
So, sending federal forces into Illinois involves navigating some serious legal and constitutional minefields. How is this different from, say, Washington, D.C., where we have seen federal deployments before?
Oh, it's a completely different legal setup. Think of it like this. D.C. isn't a state. The president has much more direct authority there over the D.C. National Guard, over federal property. It's federal turf.
So presidential orders carry more direct weight there.
Exactly. But Illinois, that's a sovereign state. It has its own governor, its own constitution, its own authority. So any federal deployment there, especially without the governor's okay or clear legal backing from Congress, it just smacks right into those states' rights arguments, the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Making a legal challenge much more likely.
Much more likely. It significantly raises the bar for federal intervention and almost certainly triggers a court battle, potentially a long one.
That distinction really highlights the legal hurdles. Okay, stepping back from the immediate legal fight, what about the broader picture? The wider implications. Our sources mention critics alleging this whole thing is politically motivated.
Yes, that's a major theme in the criticism detailed in the sources.
What's the specific allegation? Politically motivated how?
The argument is that these moves, targeting Chicago and other cities run by Democrats, aren't really about solving crime or managing immigration effectively,
But about?
but about using federal power as a tool to punish political opponents, maybe rally the president's base by creating a narrative of chaos that only strong federal action can fix, and potentially, critics argue, to expand the power of the executive branch itself, pushing past traditional limits. It raises that fundamental concern about politicizing law enforcement.
And inside Chicago, what are the concerns from, say, immigrant communities or civil liberties groups about this kind of federal buildup?
The sources highlight real alarm bells going off there. These groups are warning that more federal enforcement, especially if it feels heavy-handed or isn't coordinated with local police, just skyrockets the risk of rights abuses.
Like what kind of abuses?
Things like racial profiling, maybe unlawful stops, detentions without proper cause or process. But also, it just creates this climate of fear.
Fear and mistrust.
Exactly, which can drive immigrant communities further underground, make them afraid to interact with any authorities, even local police trying to solve local crimes. And that's especially damaging in a place like Chicago that has these specific sanctuary policies designed to build that trust. A big federal show of force could just undo all that effort.
So if we connect all these threads, what we're seeing play out in Chicago, it really feels like a snapshot of a much bigger national argument, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a perfect, if intense, example of this ongoing debate in the U.S. about balance, federal power versus local control, especially when it comes to hot-button issues like crime and immigration.
And there are very different ideas about how to handle those issues.
Clearly. You see contrasting approaches. For example, many Democrats, as the sources note, tend to emphasize investing in communities, tackling root causes, building relationships between police and residents.
Yeah.
Rather than relying on, militarized federal responses or top-down mandates.
Which forces a really important question.
Yeah. What is the right role for the federal government in local problems, especially when the local community has already decided on its own approach, its own priorities, and maybe has deep concerns about federal overreach based on past experiences? It really makes us think about the long-term health of that state-federal relationship.
It really boils down to that core tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Between executive authority wanting to enforce federal law and the idea of local self-governance, communities deciding for themselves. It's legal, but it's also deeply philosophical. So we've taken quite a deep dive here into these takeover threats in Chicago. We've looked at the president's reasons, the federal actions being considered,
Chicago's very firm resistance with that executive order.
and these really complex constitutional issues, the 10th Amendment, posse comitatus, that are now front and center.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway, looking at all this source material, is that this Chicago situation, it's way more than just a local fight. It's a reflection, a microcosm of this huge, ongoing American debate about federalism itself.
Pushing the boundaries.
Really pushing the boundaries of federal power, challenging that idea of local self-governance in a very direct way. So as you think about all this, maybe consider, How might these kinds of clashes shape the future? Not just for Chicago, but for cities across the country. How does it change the balance of power? What actually happens when different levels of government fundamentally disagree on how to run things, and one level decides to use force, essentially, to impose its will?
That is a powerful question, and one with deep historical roots. It's definitely something to keep thinking about.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive today. We really encourage you to keep exploring these complex and vital issues as they continue to develop. Until next time.